At the family dinner, my mother leaned forward with that sharp look she always saved for me, and her voice cut through the clinking silverware as she snarled that unless I gave the house to my sister, I would end up in jail. My sister's eyes lit up like she had been waiting for this moment her whole life, and she snapped that I was just a single mother, unwanted by anyone, and asked what use I could possibly have for a house. The words hung over the table, heavy and cruel, but instead of breaking me, they only made me smile. I shared a glance with my lawyer sitting quietly at my side, and I couldn't hold back the small laugh that echoed across the room, a sound that made their confidence flicker just for a second. If you're still listening, let me pause for a heartbeat and tell you something important. Every like, every kind comment, every subscription means the world to me, because it tells me I am not alone in facing people who think they can bully someone just because she's quieter. Your support keeps me strong enough to share more stories like this. So if you're here with me now, let me know. It truly matters. I'm Olivia, I'm 30 years old, and I've been a single mom ever since my ex decided that responsibility wasn't for him. I work, I pay my bills, I keep my son safe, and I hold on to the house my grandmother loved so much, the house that feels like the last solid thing she left me. I've been underestimated most of my life, pushed into corners where people thought I would stay silent, but tonight's dinner proved that those days are over, because I had prepared for this moment long before the soup was even served. I let them think I was cornered. I let them raise their voices and enjoy the taste of their own arrogance, but deep down I knew something they didn't. The real story had already been written, not with shouting or threats, but with quiet documents and careful preparation, and the useless one at that table wasn't me. From the very beginning of my life, it seemed as though my family had drawn invisible lines that placed me on one side and my sister on the other, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never cross into her world of praise and indulgence. When there were chores to be done, they were handed to me with the expectation that I would obey without protest, while my sister lounged with a book or a phone in her hand as if housework were beneath her. Every time I asked why she was excused, I was told she needed rest, or that she was delicate, or that I should learn responsibility because one day I would need it more than her. Over time, those small injustices grew heavy, like pebbles in my pockets, that weighed me down until I could hardly move without feeling the imbalance. I grew used to being the quiet one who cleaned up after everyone else, while my sister grew used to being celebrated for doing nothing at all. As we got older, the pattern only deepened. My mother would brag endlessly about my sister's achievements, no matter how minor, and in the same breath dismiss mine as unimportant, as though hard work only mattered if it came with a spotlight. When I found part-time jobs as a teenager to buy my own clothes, I was told it was because I wasn't naturally gifted the way my sister was. But when she spent weekends shopping with friends, my mother called it well-deserved relaxation. The message was clear. She was entitled to enjoy life while I was expected to serve it. By the time I married young and later found myself raising my son alone, my mother had already built the habit of speaking about me as if I were a disappointment she simply tolerated. At church, she would smile and boast about my sister's bright future, then lower her voice to a whisper when asked about me, as though my existence were a shameful secret best kept quiet. The house, my grandmother's house, became the biggest symbol of this divide. When she passed, she left behind more than furniture and faded wallpaper. She left behind a place of safety that I had fought to preserve, a place where I poured every ounce of effort into repairs and bills while raising a child alone. My mother and sister resented that I lived there, speaking as if I had taken something that rightfully belonged to them, ignoring the fact that I was the one replacing the gutters, mowing the lawn, scrubbing the floors, and paying the taxes on time. They claimed my sister deserved the house more because she would know how to use it properly, which in their language meant she would fill it with parties, expensive decor, and endless reminders of her superiority. It never mattered to them that my son's laughter filled those rooms, or that my sweat kept the roof from caving in, because in their eyes, my life and my work would always count for less. Every family gathering seemed to revolve around this poisoned subject. My sister would sip her wine with a smirk and joke that one day soon she'd finally move into her house, while my mother nodded in agreement and threw me sharp glances meant to remind me of my lower place. I sat quietly, pretending not to hear, feeding my son and teaching him to use his fork properly, smiling as if the words didn't pierce straight through me. But inside, resentment was building, quiet and strong, and each cutting remark added fuel to a fire I no longer intended to keep hidden. For years I thought silence was survival, but now I realized it only fed their arrogance, and the more they pressed, the closer I came to a point where I would no longer accept their version of the story. Tonight's dinner, with its threats and cruel jabs, was the moment all those years of swallowed hurt began to transform into something sharper, something powerful, and they had no idea that their own arrogance was preparing the stage for their downfall. By the time dessert plates clinked against the table, my mother's voice had sharpened into something closer to a warning than conversation, and she leaned across the polished wood with the kind of authority she had always tried to project but never truly possessed. From her bag, she pulled out a thin folder and set it down with a dramatic little thud, patting it as though it contained the secrets of the universe, while her lips curved into a smile that reeked of triumph. She began to speak about supposed evidence, insisting she had papers that would prove I was unfit to manage a house, weaving tales about unpaid taxes, overdue bills, and potential legal consequences waiting to strike. Her words carried a false rhythm, polished from years of controlling family arguments, but I noticed how her fingers twitched against the folder and how the corners of the papers were still warm from the printer. My sister leaned in, eager to add her own lines to the performance, declaring that I had always been reckless, that I had no business pretending to be a homeowner, that the house would eventually rot under my careless watch. She claimed she would transform it into something magnificent, describing renovations and gleaming countertops, as though beauty alone equaled responsibility. The two of them volleyed their lines back and forth, louder and harsher with every sentence, each insult meant to push me further into silence. I did not rise to their bait. I sat there with my fork in hand, the silver glint catching the light as though it were a calm reminder of control, and I let them keep talking, pouring out threats until the air around us grew heavy with the sound of their own arrogance. My mother shook the folder once more, reminding everyone that these so-called papers contained the truth, hinting that a judge would surely agree with her, and smirking as though the verdict had already been written. My sister's voice grew more animated, almost giddy, as she painted pictures of her future life in her house, describing family gatherings on a new deck, stylish living rooms filled with guests, and a kitchen she claimed would finally feel worthy of her. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that she did not see me as her sister, but as an obstacle, one she planned to bulldoze with words and empty legal threats. Around the table, relatives shifted uncomfortably, yet no one interrupted, because this was how it had always been. My mother commanding, my sister echoing, and me forced into silence. But this time, instead of shrinking under the weight of their accusations, I watched with an odd calmness, almost amused at how predictable their routine had become. Their threats of legal doom, their grand declarations of my incompetence, and their smug insistence that I was living on borrowed time all sounded rehearsed, as if they had practiced in front of a mirror. They threw around words like lawsuit and court, dropping them like bombs they believed would make me flinch, and my mother even whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear that jail was not out of the question for someone who tried to cheat her family. The word jail lingered in the air, heavy and cruel, meant to humiliate me into submission, and I saw the small, satisfied curl of her lips when she thought she had landed the final blow. My sister laughed then, a sharp, ugly laugh that grated against the walls, claiming that she would be generous enough to let me stay in a guest room once the house was legally hers, as if charity were her birthright. They thought they were delivering my sentence, not realizing they were only rehearsing their own downfall. Inside me, something shifted, a quiet realization that fear no longer had a place in this conversation. I felt the calmness of someone who had already done the work, gathered the documents, and prepared for this very performance long before the evening began. While they waved papers with shaky signatures and filled the room with empty threats, I thought of the meticulous receipts I had stored, the notarized filings tucked away safely, and the lawyer at my side who enjoyed details more than either of them ever could. Every insult, every accusation, every exaggerated claim became not a wound but a note in a growing record, and I knew that their confidence was nothing more than a castle built on sand. They believed they had cornered me, but what they didn't see was that every word out of their mouths tightened the knot of a rope that would eventually catch only them. So I nodded occasionally, feigning the expression of someone who was wavering, allowing them to feel their imagined victory, while inside I held steady to the truth. Soon, very soon, the power would shift, and the silence I carried would roar louder than all their shouting combined. There was a time in my life when a single sharp word from my mother could unravel me completely, when the thought of disappointing her filled me with such dread that I would agree to anything just to make the tension dissolve. I remember signing away small things, my savings from a summer job, a piece of jewelry from my grandmother, even the right to spend holidays where I chose, because I thought giving in meant love, or at least peace. Back then, I believed that silence was survival, that if I bent far enough I might avoid breaking, yet all it did was teach them that my back was theirs to lean on whenever they wished. I can still recall how many nights I lay awake rehearsing apologies for mistakes I had never made, promising myself I would do better tomorrow, blind to the truth that no amount of obedience could ever earn the respect they had already denied me. That was the girl they used to know, the one they thought would always bow her head, but she is gone now. Motherhood changed me in ways I never anticipated. The moment I held my son for the first time, I felt a shift deep inside, a kind of fierce clarity that cut through years of doubt and hesitation. Suddenly, I wasn't just living for myself. I was responsible for a small life that depended on me to stand tall, and with that responsibility came strength I never knew I had. It was no longer enough to avoid conflict or swallow insults. I had to show him what resilience looked like, what dignity meant, what it was to fight quietly but relentlessly for what is right. Every long night, rocking him to sleep, every early morning, rushing to work with tired eyes, every bill paid on time while others doubted me. These things built a spine of steel inside me. The girl who once apologized for existing had grown into a woman who learned that calm can be louder than rage when it is steady and unshaken. I also discovered that strength is not about raising your voice or throwing punches, but about doing the unglamorous, patient work that no one notices until it matters. I learned to file documents carefully, to keep records, to photograph repairs and save receipts, to know my rights not from gossip, but from the law itself. It was uncelebrated work, the kind that drew no applause, yet it quietly rebuilt my sense of worth, one detail at a time. I realized that every boundary set, every no, spoken firmly but without anger, was a small brick in the wall that kept my son and me safe. Where once I had trembled at the idea of confrontation, now I felt grounded in the knowledge that truth was on my side, and truth does not need to shout. My mother and sister still saw me as the trembling girl of the past, blind to the fact that years of struggle had forged someone far stronger than they could imagine. So as they raised their voices at the dinner table, throwing threats and insults as though they were arrows meant to pierce me, I sat still with my fork balanced between my fingers, my face calm, my eyes steady. Inside, I thought of the contrast, the weak girl I once was, bending to survive, and the woman I had become, standing firm not for applause but for justice. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, her reminder that good fences and good papers protect more than property, they protect dignity, and for the first time I truly understood her wisdom. The room may have seen me as silent, but silence no longer meant surrender. It meant preparation, patience, and strength, disguised as stillness. They thought I was the same fragile daughter and sister they had always controlled, but the truth was already unfolding, and soon the difference between who I had been and who I had become would be impossible to ignore. The turning point didn't arrive with shouting voices or flashing lights, but instead came in the soft rustle of old papers tucked away in my grandmother's belongings, hidden in places no one else bothered to look. After her funeral, I had been the only one willing to spend weeks sorting through her things, not because anyone expected me to, but because I felt she deserved respect in the way her life was handled. My mother and sister weren't interested in faded curtains or recipe boxes. They wanted only the jewelry, the antiques, and above all, the deed to the house. So I alone opened the cabinets, sifted through dusty books, and carried boxes filled with the scent of flour and old wood. Inside one of those boxes, buried beneath cards smudged with cinnamon and vanilla, I found an envelope sealed carefully and marked with the name of a law office. My hand stilled as I opened it, and what I discovered inside was more powerful than any weapon they could ever wave at me across a dinner table. It was not simply a will, but a trust deed with strict instructions, written years earlier by a grandmother who had lived long enough to know exactly how selfishness can tear a family apart. The trust spelled out its terms with the kind of practicality that made me smile through tears. The house would never go to the one who shouted the loudest, nor to the child who looked most polished, nor to the one my mother praised most often. Instead, the property would belong to whichever family member had cared for it, maintained it, and kept up with taxes and repairs after my grandmother's health began to decline. There was no room for favoritism or manipulation, only cold proof of responsibility, receipts, records, inspections, and documents filed consistently year after year. At first, I panicked, wondering if I had overlooked something. But when I opened my filing cabinet and ran my hands across the neatly labeled binders, I realized I had unknowingly prepared for this all along. Every utility bill, every property tax form stamped paid, every plumber's invoice, even photos I had taken after repainting the fence or patching the roof, all of it had been saved because I was simply trying to stay organized. What once felt like tedious chores suddenly revealed themselves as pieces of armor, each one shining brighter than the folder of forged threats my mother carried to dinner. And then there was the part that nearly made me laugh aloud in disbelief. Years ago, my sister had borrowed money from our grandmother, scribbling her name on a casual promissory note with the cocky certainty of someone who believed she would never have to pay it back. She had brushed it off as a family favor, the kind of thing everyone would forget, but my grandmother had tucked that note neatly into the trust paperwork, linking it forever to the property. Legally speaking, instead of inheriting, my sister stood in debt, and the very house she so boldly claimed as hers could never pass to her until the debt was addressed. It was such a simple, almost delicate act of foresight, and it revealed the quiet wisdom of a woman who knew exactly which of her descendants would value responsibility over vanity. In her gentle but deliberate way, my grandmother had given me not only the gift of her home, but also the tools to shield it from those who would abuse it, like she had whispered encouragement from beyond the grave. The discovery filled me with a steadiness I had not known in years. As my mother and sister sharpened their words and prepared their false threats, I carried inside me a secret that made their noise almost laughable. They believed I was cornered, yet I held the law itself folded in my bag, resting like a silent ally, waiting for the right moment. I did not reveal it right away, because strength is not always in the strike, but in the patience to wait for the perfect opening. So I smiled politely at dinner, listening to their arrogance, while my thoughts wandered back to that recipe box, to the cinnamon-scented papers, to the letter that proved my grandmother had known exactly what would happen after she was gone. That hidden truth became my ember of hope, glowing steadily, a reminder that all of their noise could be erased in an instant by a single page of real authority. And for the first time in a long time, I felt not only safe, but quietly powerful, because I understood that justice was already mine. It was simply waiting for its reveal. When I first held the trust documents in my hands, I realized that victory would not come from shouting louder than my mother or sister, nor from meeting their cruelty head-on with equal rage. It would come from patience, order, and the steady work of preparation, the kind of slow, quiet effort they had always dismissed as weakness. That was when I contacted a lawyer recommended by one of my co-workers, a man who smiled more at a well-organized binder than at a fancy dinner, and who believed that truth lives in details. He wasn't the type to intimidate anyone with grand speeches, but he had a sharp eye and a love for paperwork that made me feel safe. Together, we went through every scrap of documentation I had collected over the years: tax returns stamped paid, water and electric bills filed neatly by month, repair invoices from plumbers and roofers, photographs of freshly painted fences, even grocery receipts that showed me budgeting carefully while maintaining the house. Each item that once felt like another burden of responsibility now transformed into a brick in the fortress we were building. By the time we finished assembling everything, I could see the shape of protection forming around me, solid and undeniable. But he reminded me that defense alone wasn't enough. We needed to anticipate the attacks that were surely coming, so I began to turn the cruelty of my mother and sister into records, stripping it of its sting. Every phone call where my mother demanded the deed, every message from my sister boasting about how she would soon redecorate her house, every remark made in passing about my supposed failures was carefully documented with dates, times, and witnesses when possible. At first it felt strange, almost cold, to treat their insults like evidence, but soon I realized that silence had always been their weapon, and turning words into paper was how I disarmed them. We filled entire folders, each section labeled with tabs so neat and precise that even my lawyer chuckled and said it looked more like a scrapbook than a legal defense. And yet that was the beauty of it. It was my scrapbook of survival, proof that I had been living not in chaos, as they claimed, but in steady responsibility and order. The more I prepared, the more I began to change on the inside. For years I had thought of myself as someone trying to keep up, someone barely staying afloat, but as I looked at the mountain of evidence stacked high on the desk, I began to see myself differently. I was not a victim or a burden. I was the caretaker who had kept the roof from leaking, the taxes from piling up, the yard from falling into ruin. My sister loved to imagine herself as glamorous and capable, but her debts and broken promises lay bare the truth. My mother believed her authority was enough to scare me into submission, but in the end, authority without facts is only noise. As I quietly gathered their words, their threats, and their mistakes, I understood that every step I had taken up to this point, every shift at work, every bill I paid on time, every night I lay awake planning how to stretch $1 further, had been part of a much larger preparation. The girl they underestimated had been slowly sharpening herself into the woman who would one day dismantle their lies. Through it all, I carried one steady thought. This was not just about a house. This was about showing my son that dignity does not mean avoiding conflict at any cost, and strength does not mean shouting the loudest in the room. Real strength often hides in quiet persistence, in doing the unglamorous work that no one claps for, in preparing carefully so that when the storm comes, you already hold the umbrella. That is why, even as I built my legal armor, I also wanted to share my journey beyond the walls of my home. If you are listening to this now, please know how much your likes, your comments, and your subscriptions mean to me. They are not just casual clicks. They are a reminder that women like me are not alone in standing up against those who try to silence us. Each kind word you leave feels like another brick of support beneath my feet, and together they create a foundation as strong as any deed. With your help, I can keep telling these stories, and maybe, just maybe, remind others that preparation and truth will always outlast arrogance and noise. As the evening dragged on, the polite chatter that had once filled the dining room fell silent, replaced by the heavy sound of my mother and sister preparing to unleash what they clearly believed was their final and decisive blow. My mother, with the self-importance she had always carried like a crown, reached into her bag and pulled out a folder with a dramatic flourish, setting it down in front of me with a thud loud enough to turn heads. The folder, stuffed with papers printed in large, bold fonts, was clearly meant to impress, though even from where I sat, the formatting looked amateurish, as if it had been typed up by someone playing lawyer on a home computer. She pressed her palm on top of it, announcing that this was an official legal agreement, and declared that if I wanted to avoid disgrace, I would sign it immediately. My sister, eyes glittering with malice and anticipation, leaned closer and urged me to stop delaying what she called the inevitable, insisting that everyone knew the house was hers by right. Their voices, sharp and commanding, rolled through the room with the confidence of people who had bullied for so long they couldn't imagine a world where their power might falter. The humiliation they crafted was deliberate, sharp-edged and relentless, designed to strip me of dignity in front of everyone present. My mother, with her chin lifted high, spoke about how embarrassing it was for the family to have me stubbornly clinging to a property I could not manage. She claimed the neighbors were laughing, that the church ladies whispered about my failure, and that people shook their heads at how far beneath my sister I had always been. My sister seized her cue, piling on with cruel satisfaction, describing in detail how she and her fiancé would transform the house once it belonged to them, how it would finally shine as a proper reflection of her success. She scoffed at my modest life, mocking my single motherhood, my job, my quiet existence, and painted every part of me as inadequate compared to her imagined perfection. The more venom she poured, the more I could feel the tension ripple through the room, and though no one dared to openly interrupt, I noticed the shifting of chairs, the downward glances, the fidgeting hands of relatives who could no longer pretend not to see the ugliness on display. But even that wasn't enough for them. My mother raised her voice higher, warning that city inspectors would soon condemn the house because of neglect, suggesting that government agencies might soon be knocking at my door, her words heavy with false authority as though she commanded the law itself. She waved her hand like a queen dismissing a servant, declaring that she had already spoken to people who knew people, and that my ownership was nothing but a technicality soon to be undone. My sister, emboldened by the rising tide of intimidation, crossed a line so sharp it silenced even her own fiancé. She described how she planned to tear down the walls of what she called my outdated little space, casually mentioning that my son's bedroom would make a perfect wine cellar. Her tone was breezy, careless, as if his comfort, his safety, his very presence in the home meant nothing more than an obstacle to her next dinner party. The cruelty of it landed in the air like a stone, heavy and shocking, and for a brief moment I saw hesitation flicker in the eyes of a few family members, people who had long sided with her, but now found the callousness difficult to excuse. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, while the storm of their arrogance whipped itself into a frenzy. They mistook my silence for surrender, believing that my lowered gaze and steady breathing meant I was finally breaking under their weight. In truth, I was watching them unravel, listening as their voices climbed higher, their accusations wilder, their threats less tethered to reality. Every exaggerated claim, every insult hurled across the table, every boast about the future they were certain would be theirs, was another brick in the tower they were building, a tower destined to collapse under its own weight. I glanced at my lawyer, who remained calm and silent beside me, his small nod telling me everything I needed to know. We were ready. Tonight they thought they had cornered me with fake papers, false authority, and humiliation dressed up as strength, but what they had really done was hand me the stage I needed. The higher they climbed on their mountain of arrogance, the greater the fall would be when the truth came crashing down, and though they didn't realize it yet, the first crack had already begun to form. At the exact moment when my mother and sister's confidence seemed to reach its peak, I slowly pushed their fake agreement aside and placed my own folder on the table. A folder that looked ordinary on the outside, but carried inside it the weight of truth. I didn't raise my voice or try to match their theatrics. I simply slid the first document forward, letting the smooth paper rest where all eyes could see. It was the original trust deed, stamped, notarized, and bound with details that left no room for debate. My lawyer, still calm and deliberate, nodded as I opened it, his quiet presence more powerful than all their shouting. My sister's smirk faltered for the first time, her eyes narrowing as though she couldn't quite process that the paper in front of her was more than a bluff. My mother leaned closer, scanning the words with a frown, her lips pressed tightly together as she realized this was no casual printout made on a home computer. This was the law, written years ago, signed by my grandmother, and still standing as strong as the day it was created. I began not with accusations, but with facts. Every year since my grandmother's health had failed, I had paid the property taxes on time, and I had the receipts neatly documented to prove it. I had handled every repair. The plumbing that burst in winter, the roof patched before storms, the fence mended after it cracked, and I had invoices, photographs, and statements from contractors, each one dated and signed. My lawyer opened the binder with practiced ease, laying the evidence out piece by piece like pearls on a string, until the table that had once been filled with their noise was now covered in proof of my stewardship. The trust's clause was clear. The house would go not to the eldest or the favored, but to the one who had cared for it faithfully, and the evidence showed beyond question that I had done exactly that. My sister shifted uncomfortably, her earlier arrogance slipping as she realized her words about remodeling and tearing down walls were not dreams but admissions, and admissions carried weight in legal terms. Then came the part neither of them had expected, the small but devastating detail they had overlooked. My sister's forgotten debt, that casual promissory note she had scribbled years ago when she borrowed money from my grandmother, sat neatly in its own sleeve, attached directly to the trust documents. She had treated it like a family favor, long since buried, but the ink on the paper was still as sharp as the day she signed it, her name looped in handwriting that no one could deny. My lawyer explained calmly that instead of inheriting, she stood legally indebted, and the estate could enforce repayment if challenged. The color drained from her face, and for once she sat silent, the reality of her past arrogance staring back at her in black and white. My mother tried to interrupt, tried to dismiss the debt as irrelevant, but every word only revealed her desperation, and the room full of relatives could see it clearly now. The power she had always claimed was slipping fast. Finally, I reminded them of the most important condition, the clause my grandmother had insisted on, that the home remain a stable, safe place for a minor child. When I repeated my sister's own words about tearing out my son's bedroom to build a wine cellar, the lawyer marked them down as a material statement of intent, a direct violation of the very condition that secured my ownership. The silence that followed was deafening. For years, I had been painted as the weak one, the unwanted one, the single mother clinging to scraps, but now it was my mother and sister who looked cornered, their confidence cracking under the weight of truth they could no longer twist. The folder of fake documents they had shoved in my face moments earlier now looked like nothing more than a prop in a failed performance, while mine sat heavy with the undeniable power of preparation. And as their voices faltered, I felt the first wave of justice settling into the room, steady and unstoppable. The moment I laid out the trust papers, the room seemed to shift, as though the walls themselves were leaning closer to witness what was unfolding. My lawyer began to speak in a calm, measured tone, carefully walking everyone through the language of the document while I sat steady, letting the truth do what my voice alone never could. He pointed to the stewardship clause, to the dates on my receipts, to the signatures on the inspection reports, showing piece by piece how every requirement had been met without fail. Then he slid forward the photographs, images of me repainting fences, receipts from the contractors who replaced the gutters, tax statements with early payments stamped clearly across the top. Where once my mother's threats had filled the table with noise, now the weight of evidence replaced every word with undeniable silence. My sister's earlier confidence evaporated as she stared at the papers, her lips parting but no words forming, her certainty dissolving like sugar in water. My lawyer did not need to raise his voice, because each page spoke louder than shouting ever could. He calmly placed my sister's promissory note on the stack, reminding her and everyone present that debts do not vanish simply because you choose to forget them. The handwriting, bold and familiar, left her no room to deny it, and for the first time in years, I saw her face pale with the realization that her past arrogance had carved her own trap. My mother attempted to interrupt, insisting that the debt was irrelevant, that the real issue was respect for the family name, but her protests sounded thin, frantic, and defensive. The more she spoke, the clearer it became to everyone at the table that her authority was nothing more than smoke now being blown away by the cold wind of facts. And then came the part that cut through the last of their illusions. My lawyer repeated, word for word, my sister's earlier boast about tearing down walls and converting my son's bedroom into a wine cellar, pointing out that this directly violated the child protection clause my grandmother had insisted upon. Gasps spread through the room as the weight of that revelation sank in, and I saw relatives who had once nodded along with my mother's judgments now shift in their seats, shaking their heads in quiet disapproval. For the first time, the shame did not sit on my shoulders. It rested squarely on theirs. My mother's glare darted from the papers to the faces of the people around her, realizing that her kingdom of intimidation had collapsed in full view of witnesses who would never forget. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my laughter quiet but unshakable as it echoed across the polished wood of the table. For years they had painted me as the useless one, the failure, the burden, yet tonight it was their arrogance and greed that lay exposed. I didn't need to gloat, didn't need to raise my voice. The silence of the room told me everything. My sister's fiancé shifted uncomfortably, clearly reconsidering the woman he thought he knew, while other relatives whispered to one another, their sympathy sliding toward me for the first time in a lifetime. In that moment, I felt a shift more profound than ownership of a house. I felt the weight of years of humiliation lifting, replaced by the strength of truth revealed publicly. They had written me off as powerless, but now they sat powerless themselves, stripped bare by their own words, and undone by the grandmother they had underestimated. The silence that followed the reveal was unlike anything I had ever heard in my family before. For years, every gathering had been filled with my mother's sharp commands and my sister's smug laughter, while I sat quietly in the corner, absorbing the sting of words I could never seem to escape. But now the balance had shifted, and the air felt heavy with recognition. My lawyer's calm voice cut through the quiet as he laid out the sequence of documents, each one confirming the same truth. I had fulfilled every obligation in the trust. I had proven myself the caretaker of the home, and any attempt to force me out was not only immoral, but illegal. The very table where I had once been shamed now became the place where their authority cracked, and the expressions of the relatives around us confirmed what I already knew. The performance my mother and sister had staged had failed spectacularly. My mother tried to salvage her dignity by raising her voice, declaring that family loyalty should outweigh paperwork, that it was disgraceful to hide behind documents instead of love. But her words rang hollow because everyone could see the irony. For years she had used her authority like a weapon, never once guided by loyalty or fairness, and now that the law contradicted her, she sought to rewrite the meaning of family. My sister attempted a weak smile, pretending none of it mattered, insisting that she didn't care about the house anyway, but the tightness in her jaw and the tremble in her hands betrayed her. Her fiancé, who had once joined in her arrogance, leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable, and for the first time I wondered if he was beginning to see the cracks that lay beneath her polished exterior. What had begun as their moment of triumph was now a stage where they were exposed, and no amount of denial could stitch their reputations back together. The consequences rippled outward, faster and sharper than I expected. Relatives who had once sided with my mother began to murmur openly, recalling past slights and moments of cruelty that they had brushed aside, now seeing them in a different light. A cousin spoke up quietly, reminding my sister that debts cannot be ignored, and another aunt shook her head, saying that threatening to take a child's bedroom away for the sake of a wine cellar was shameful. My mother bristled, trying to silence them, but the tide had already turned. The witnesses she had counted on for silent approval had instead become witnesses of her humiliation, and she could no longer control the narrative. What she thought would be a moment of my defeat had become the moment of her exposure, and it happened not behind closed doors, but in front of the very people she wanted to impress. For me, the victory was not about shouting or revenge, but about the clarity of boundaries finally being set in stone. My lawyer explained gently but firmly that from this moment forward, any attempt to enter the property without permission would be considered trespassing, that harassment could be documented and reported, and that the law was firmly on my side. The house, once a symbol of my vulnerability, had now become the shield of my dignity. And there was no turning back. I felt my shoulders straighten, my breath deepen, and for the first time in years, I tasted the calm sweetness of justice. The same house they had tried to use against me had become the very stage on which their arrogance was destroyed. And though I didn't gloat, I let the moment rest as it was, undeniable, unshakable, and final. That night, when I finally left the dinner table where I had been ambushed so many times before, something inside me shifted forever. For most of my life, I had walked into those family gatherings with my shoulders tight and my heart heavy, expecting humiliation as naturally as one expects rain in a storm. I had grown so used to bowing my head, to apologizing for things I had never done, to letting my mother and sister dictate the story of who I was, that I barely noticed how small I had allowed myself to become. But as I stepped out into the cool night air after that confrontation, I realized those days had ended. My lungs filled deeply, freely, as though I had been holding my breath for 30 years and had finally remembered how to exhale. The house I returned to looked the same on the surface, the familiar peeling wallpaper, the creaking step on the staircase, the kitchen window that always stuck halfway open, but it no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like mine in a way it never had before, not because I had just defended it, but because I had defended myself. In the following days, I didn't celebrate with champagne or grand announcements, because victory for me wasn't about spectacle. Instead, I chose the kind of joy that speaks softly but lasts, the kind of joy that seeps into your bones and makes you stronger. I planned a small backyard cookout for my son and his friends, decorating with simple balloons from the dollar store, grilling burgers that filled the air with smoke and spice, and laughing as the children chased each other barefoot through the grass. I sat back in a lawn chair, paper plate in my lap, and let myself absorb every detail. The way the balloons bobbed in the breeze, the way my son's laughter carried through the yard, the way the setting sun painted the old fence gold. It was a scene my sister would have sneered at, too ordinary for her glossy dreams, but for me it was perfection, because in those small, simple details was everything I had fought for: safety, stability, and a home where my child could grow without fear of being uprooted by greed. On the back porch, I placed a photograph of my grandmother, the woman whose foresight had made all of this possible. The frame wasn't expensive, just a simple wooden border, but I put it in the spot where I would see her every time I opened the door. And every time I did, I whispered a quiet thank you, remembering her steady hands and her quiet wisdom. She had always believed that strength didn't come from loud voices or flashy gestures, but from patience, honesty, and the willingness to do the right thing even when no one was watching. As I looked at her picture, I realized she had known this fight would come, and she had trusted me to be ready. I felt her presence in the rustle of the trees, in the laughter of the children, in the comfort of walls that stood strong because she had built more than a house. She had built a legacy. By living in that home and protecting it with dignity, I wasn't just honoring her memory. I was proving her right. But perhaps the greatest change was the one inside me. I no longer saw myself as the girl who trembled when her mother raised her voice, nor as the sister who shrank in the shadow of someone else's entitlement. I saw myself as a woman who had faced cruelty with calm, who had chosen preparation over panic, who had turned silence into strength. My mother and sister might continue their gossip, spinning stories to nurse their wounded pride, but they could never erase the image burned into everyone's memory of the night their arrogance collapsed. That memory was my shield now, and it reminded me daily that I was no longer living on borrowed confidence, but on a foundation I had built myself. Boundaries that had once been invisible were now carved clearly into place, as strong and unyielding as the deed with my name on it. And for the first time in my life, I woke each morning not bracing for their next attack, but savoring the quiet certainty that I had reclaimed not just a house, but the woman I was always meant to be. In the weeks and months that followed that unforgettable dinner, I began to notice the ripple effect of what had happened, spreading far beyond the walls of that dining room. For years, my mother had walked through our community with her head tilted high, her voice dripping with authority, certain that her words alone were enough to define the truth. My sister had followed at her side like a shadow polished into gold, laughing at me, boasting about her imagined future, and feeding off the respect my mother demanded from others. But after that night, their arrogance no longer carried the same weight. At church, the same women who once leaned in eagerly to hear my mother's gossip now pursed their lips and shook their heads when she tried to speak. At the grocery store, where I had once hurried down aisles to avoid stares, people stopped me to say they admired how I had handled myself, that they were proud of the way I had stood tall. For the first time in my life, I was not the subject of pity or judgment, but of respect, and though I had never asked for validation, the quiet recognition warmed me like sunlight after a storm. My mother, stripped of her imagined crown, grew quieter, though not gentler. She sulked in corners, retelling versions of the story where she was the victim, but fewer and fewer people listened. The authority she once wielded had been revealed as nothing but intimidation, and once the mask slipped, there was no way to put it back on. My sister fared even worse. She tried at first to continue her performance, tossing her hair and insisting she didn't care about the house, that it was too small for her grand plans anyway. But the cracks were too obvious. Her fiancé, who had once joined her laughter, began to withdraw, and whispers soon reached me that their relationship was crumbling. The very qualities she had flaunted, her ambition, her boldness, her ability to manipulate, were suddenly the very flaws people gossiped about. It was almost poetic. The house they had tried to steal became the symbol of their downfall, while the quiet strength they had mocked in me became the source of my stability. They had sought to shame me in public, but it was they who were now living in the shadow of shame. For me, victory did not feel like triumph in the way movies often show it. No fireworks, no cheering crowds, no dramatic speeches. It felt like quiet mornings in my kitchen, sipping tea by the window while the sun spilled across the table, and knowing I could finally breathe without bracing for attack. It felt like afternoons in the backyard with my son, planting flowers in the soil, teaching him how roots grow deeper when they are nurtured with patience. It felt like walking down the street and lifting my head high, not in arrogance, but in peace. I began to dream again, small dreams that meant everything. Taking night classes, repainting the living room, maybe starting a little garden where my grandmother once grew roses. These weren't grand gestures, but they were mine, and for the first time in a long time, I believed in the future without fear that someone would rip it away. My home had become more than walls and a roof. It was a sanctuary where my son and I could laugh, grow, and build a life free from the claws of greed. And if I were to leave behind a single lesson from all of this, it would be that true strength does not shout. It endures, it prepares, it waits until the time is right, and then it speaks with a calm so undeniable that even the loudest arrogance cannot smother it. My mother and sister had spent years calling me the weak one, the useless one, the single mother with no future, but in the end, it was their pride and entitlement that collapsed while my persistence carried me forward. Justice, I discovered, is not always a roaring storm. Sometimes it is the steady shuffle of papers in a lawyer's hands, the laughter of a child in a safe yard, the quiet dignity of someone who refuses to surrender. The moral is simple: never mistake kindness for weakness, and never underestimate the power of the quiet ones, for when the storm finally breaks, it is they who stand tallest. My grandmother knew this truth long before I did, and as I sit in the home she entrusted to me, I feel her wisdom alive in every wall, every creak of the floor, every memory we continue to build. In the end, the useless ones were never me. They were the ones who believed arrogance could replace love, and the world finally saw it too. If you've been with me through this story, I'd love to hear what you think. Your likes, your comments, and your subscriptions mean so much more than numbers. They tell me I'm not alone in these battles, and that these stories matter. Share your thoughts below. Let me know if you've ever faced something like this, or simply say hi, so I know you're here. Every bit of support helps me keep creating, and honestly, it makes my day brighter knowing you're out there listening.